All right, so today I am pleased to have with us Dana Kelly. She's the executive director of the Norwegian-American Genealogical Center and Library. This is in Madison, Wisconsin. And she will be talking to us about that center today and about Norwegian history and research. So I'm going to turn it over to her now. And we're very excited that you're here.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me today. I think I've got my screen sharing. Did I do that correctly?
Yes, you do.
Oh, fantastic. So yes, like Sarah mentioned, I am Dana Kelly, and I've served as the director here at NAGC for about 4 years now. And I've been researching my family for about 30 years. So I've been chasing after those ancestors just like you guys have for quite a long time. And my love of family history led me to a Scandinavian studies degree. There is such a thing, from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then eventually to my position here. And I've also been very active in our local historical society and our local genealogical society for a number of years and served on both of their boards of directors. But what is NAGC? Well, we are the most comprehensive library in North America that is dedicated exclusively to Norwegian and Norwegian-American genealogy. There are other larger libraries, of course, that are dedicated to genealogy, but we are the most comprehensive one for this specific ethnic group. In 2020, we undertook some pretty extensive renovations. We added an elevator to our library. We updated all of our lighting. We updated our bathrooms, so now they're all ADA compliant. So if you are ever in Madison, please come and visit us. We would love to see you and show you around. Now, this is our founder. His name was Gerhard Naeseth, and initially his genealogy collection was his own personal collection. It was in his home, and he began collecting Norwegian genealogy materials just for his own person, to satisfy his own personal curiosity back in the 1940s. And he was employed by the University of Wisconsin library system. And so he influenced their collection as well and used his connections there to amass an even larger personal collection. So finally, in 1974, he decided to incorporate as a nonprofit organization, and he founded the Vesterheim Genealogy Center, and he affiliated with the Vesterheim Museum in Decorah, Iowa, and operated under their umbrella of a 501c3 for a number of years. Eventually, his collection outgrew his office and his garage and his house, and he moved his collection to our current location in downtown Madison. We are located at 415 West Main Street, and he moved here in 1992. And eventually it did become clear that Vesterheim's mission as a museum didn't really include genealogy. And so in 2007, the Vesterheim Genealogy Center separated as a completely independent nonprofit organization in Wisconsin and became the Norwegian-American Genealogical Center and Naeseth Library, which is what we are today. And today we have over 1,200 members throughout the United States, Canada, and Norway. So our collection has over 10,000 items in it. And if you're not a library, that probably sounds like a lot of things. But when you can compare us to public libraries or the Allen County Public Library that has over 2 million books, 10,000 is a much smaller scale. But we are very specialized, so our collection is not as large as your typical public library. Now, the main reason that people come to see us is our collection of bygdelags, which I will talk about in a bit. A large portion of our collection is family histories. So this is published material about particular families. Some of them are professionally published, some of them are amateur published histories. Most of them have been donated to us by our members who have researched their own family and then donated the finished work to us. And those can be a really great source of family stories and family photos, and a great way to try to network and connect with your living family. We also have a pretty large collection of other Norwegian-American resources like church histories and community histories from other parts of communities and other areas that were settled heavily by Norwegian immigrants. So we have a lot of things from Wisconsin and Iowa and Minnesota and the Dakotas. And some of what we have on the shelves include Gerhard Naeseth's personal collection. Every once in a while, I'll pick up a book and open it up, and there's his address label stuck inside. So we still do have a lot of those original items that he was collecting, 60 years ago. Many of the books on our shelves are available from other libraries, but we do have some things that can't be found anywhere else. Gerhard Naeseth was compiling Norwegian immigration data long before Family Search or Ancestry or any of these other genealogy services were ever even dreamed about. He would go through passenger lists and the US Census and state censuses and church records. And he created lists and indexes for Norwegian-American family researchers. And several of those lists that he worked on have now been turned into searchable databases that are available on our website. In my opinion, one of the most important projects that he undertook was his cemetery transcription project. And I'm not joking, he would spend his summer vacation when school wasn't in session. He would trek through cemeteries throughout the Midwest that were primarily communities that were settled by Norwegian Americans, and he would transcribe headstones. So what I like to say is he was Find a Grave for Norwegian Americans decades before there was findagrave.com. And what makes his research so valuable, his transcription so valuable, is that he has headstones in there that no longer exist or that are illegible today because he was doing this in the 60s and 70s. So a lot of the headstones that we can no longer read today were still legible back when he was going through these cemeteries. Now, one of our proprietary collections that was not created by Gerhard Naeseth is our database that contains soldiers who served in the 15th Wisconsin during the Civil War. If you're familiar at all with Norwegian history or perhaps the history of the Civil War, there was a regiment that was known as the Scandinavian Regiment, and it was primarily made up of Norwegian immigrants. There were a handful of Danes and Swedes and some Norwegian Americans who were actually born here in the United States, but it was primarily made up of immigrants. And they mostly spoke the Norwegian language. They didn't all even speak English, but they served under Colonel Hans Hegg, who was himself a Norwegian immigrant. And this database was created by Scott Meeker, who is an avid Civil War historian. And he created this for his own enjoyment. And it eventually just became something that he wasn't interested in maintaining on his own. So he donated all of that intellectual property to NAGC. And this database is free to anyone who wants to search it. We have it available on our website. You don't need to be a member. Anybody can go ahead and search through this. And so just for the sake of an example, I grabbed a screenshot of a search for Ole Olsen. And on the bottom of the screen of the slide here are the top 3 results. So I just clicked on the first one so we could see kind of how this looks. And there's a lot of information about these soldiers in this database. We have birth and death information and the names of their parents, where they were born, information about each soldier's service. Some of the entries do include photographs. We have a number of photographs of these men, and as much biographical information as we could come up with. Sometimes we include information about what they did after they returned home from the war, including who they married, how many children they had, what business they may have gone into, if they went into politics, information like that. So I do want to spend some time talking about this amazing and uniquely Norwegian tradition, which is the bygdebok. The history of the farms in Norway is just really important to them culturally. And it is so important that most communities in Norway have published what are known as bygdebøker. A bygd is a rural community in Norway, and these books are really at the heart of our collection. They are written and published by professional historians and professional genealogists, and they tell the history of this particular community. And they include the history of their churches and their post offices and their schools and their local industries. They include information sometimes about the wildlife and the fishing industry, and the sometimes I'll go into ancient prehistory and all sorts, anything that you could consider history about the region. But most notably, the bulk of what they focus on is just extensive histories of each farm in this area. And these farm histories not only include what they may have grown on that farm, but the main focus is on the people who lived on those farms. So these are just a vast treasure to people who are researching their family in Norway. And we have over 1,500 of these in our library. From my calculations, I would guess that we are in the top 3 in North America for the size, the number of books of this nature that we have. And we are actively trying to grow this collection. Not all of these books are still in print, so we are actively working with a used bookseller in Norway to help us collect as many of these as we can possibly get our hands on, because we really do want to have what you need when you come in here to do your research. This is just a page out of a random big book that I grabbed off the shelf. And this is from the parish of Årdal. And you can see on this page, we've got Erik Olsen Hestetun and his wife, Anna Thomasdottir. And then underneath that is a list of 10 names. And with years, this is the names of this couple's children and what year these children were born. In some cases, we have the death date for their children. In the far right column, it tells what year these people, their children, immigrated to the United States. We even see for their 5th daughter here, Anna, tells who she married and what year and who she married. There's just so much information here that you can use for genealogy. It is just such an incredible resource. But like the veggies in the corner of this slide here, these books are definitely not perfect. Much to everyone's frustration, maybe especially my frustration, not every community has a bygde book. So I apologize to anyone listening if your ancestors happen to be from Jevnaker or Gran. There is no bygde book for those areas. And these are only written for rural areas because the main focus is on the farms. They're only done for rural communities. So if your ancestors have lived for many generations in a large city like Bergen or Oslo or Trondheim or Stavanger, you may not find them in a bygde book, unfortunately. Now, these books are written in a very wide variety of styles. Every author gets to decide how they want to do this. So they all, unfortunately, do it a little bit differently. So just when you get the hang of one book, you may have to move on to another one, and then the style will be completely different. Now, our staff here at NAGC, we're pretty comfortable working with these books. We look at them every day. So if you are struggling to, try to figure out how they're organized and how this one, what information is actually here, let us know. We can help you figure that out. We're pretty handy with these. Perhaps what people struggle with the most is that these books are all written in Norwegian. They are not written in English. They're not intended for an American audience. So they are written in the Norwegian language, and very few of them have been translated into English. And they are also probably not online. There are a handful that are available online, but in order to take advantage of what's in these books, you will probably have to find a physical copy in order to look at it. Now, they are very well researched. Like I said, these are done by professionals, and they are overall extremely accurate, but we do find mistakes. Usually the mistakes that we find are from my experience anyway, are omissions. So maybe the author will only list 3 of the 5 children born to a couple, or will only include the first wife and not a man's second wife. But sometimes we do find some pretty big mistakes, like maybe the wrong child is attached to the parents, or maybe the wrong husband is attached to a wife. Those errors, thankfully, are a lot less common, but the omissions definitely do exist. So it is important to double check what you find just to verify that the information in the book is accurate. So if using these books sounds fantastic, but you're hoping to get a little more guidance, we do offer a class a couple times a year, and we offer it online, and we show tips and tricks for how to use these books for genealogy. So since we do offer it online, you don't actually have to come to Madison in order to take advantage of that class. We haven't set our class dates yet for this fall, but my guess is that it will probably be in November. That's usually when we do these. Now, these Big to Book It are all different, like I said, but in a lot of cases, they do contain some maps that will show you the locations of the farms and the shapes of the farms that are in that community, so you can see how everything was laid out. And one of the reasons that this is so significant is the name of the farms in Norway is often where families in the United States have gotten their family name. Farm names in Norway are literally centuries old, and the farms have had the same name since that name was assigned to it back in the Middle Ages, or even earlier in many cases. The spelling may have changed a little bit over time, but the name has basically remained the same. And the farms still have those names. They have not been changed. If that farm still exists, you can go back to Norway and you can visit it. We're so incredibly fortunate as Norwegian Americans that we have that option, because other ethnic groups don't have that. You might be able to figure out where your ancestor was married or baptized or buried and go back and visit that church. But to be able to actually go back to the farm where they were living is something that we're able to do. And I try not to take that privilege for granted. We're very lucky. But one thing to keep in mind when we're talking about these farm names is that there may be dozens of farms that have the same name. Some are very, very common. Haugen, Holten, Berg, Dahl, Ness, Vik. These are names that are very, very common for Norwegian farms. So if you find a Haugen farm, it isn't necessarily your Haugen farm. We need to do a little research to confirm which one we're looking for. Now, Norwegian farms were often divided so that more than one son could inherit land. And the Big to Book It might show us how the farms have been divided up. So this is an actual example of a farm and how it's been divided. This one happens to be named Vik. And you can see how we've got clusters of buildings. One is called Øvrevik, and then a little farther over is Midtvik, and then over on the right-hand side is Nedrevik. So usually the root of the farm name remains the same, and then they would add something descriptive to it. So in this case, Øvre means upper, Midt means mid, and Nedre means lower. So my guess is that Øvrevik is on higher ground, Nedrevik is on lower ground, and that's how they've made that distinction. Sometimes they'll use words like Nord and Sør for north and south to indicate which part of the farm is which, or they might use Indra and Itra, which mean inner and outer, to help describe it. So it's oftentimes pretty descriptive. Some Big to Book It even have illustrations like this that show how the farms have changed over time. I really like this illustration because I think it explains a lot about Norwegian immigration. Along the right are the years, and then the width of each of these boxes illustrates the size of the farm. So like the number of acres that were controlled by each of these owners. So you can see in 1750, this Høynes farm was only divided into 4 pieces, and they were all about the same size. And then as time goes on, it gets divided up more and more. And by the time we get to 1900, there are 20 divisions of this farm. So we can see why perhaps people were eager to leave Norway in the second half of the 1800s. Their farms were getting so small that they couldn't support themselves any longer. And another thing that I wanted to point out about this illustration is that everyone on here has a patronymic name. So what that means is that the son's last name is probably different from his father's last name. Norwegians used a completely different naming tradition prior to the 1900s than we use here. And this isn't necessarily a resource that's available at NAGC, which is kind of what I wanted to focus on today, but it's such an important concept to understand because it explains a little bit about why farm history is so important when you're researching your roots. When we're looking at this diagram, if we just look at the guys on the left-hand column here, you can see at the bottom we have Lars Knudsen, and then right above him is probably his son, Lars Larsen. His last name is Larsen because his father is Lars. He is Lars's son. And then Lars Larsen's son, Odna Larsen, takes over the farm. He is Odna Larsen because his father's name is Lars. And then his son is Lars Odnesen because his father was Odna. So I am going to talk about names for just a little bit because it's probably the biggest question that we get when people first come to see us. They want to know why their ancestors had these strange names. They don't follow any customs similar to what we use in the US, but they weren't from the US. They followed different traditions. So every Norwegian had a first name that was given to them at baptism, and it was a permanent name. So just for the sake of simplicity, I've got a little family here with a father and a mother and 2 children. And their first names also are very sex specific. So we don't have to wonder, now, is Taylor a boy or a girl? That was never an issue in Norway. If your name is Anna, you are definitely a girl. Then the second part of their name is that patronymic name. And that was also permanent. It was used for their entire lives. And what a patronymic is adding son or daughter to the father's first name. So if we go back to our little family here, if Mikkel's father is named Lars, his name is Mikkel Larsen. And if Sigrid's father's name is Oli, her name is going to be Sigrid Olsdottir. And their children are going to be Mikkel's daughter and Mikkel's son because their father is named Mikkel. And so everyone in this family has a different patronymic, either because they are different sexes, like the brother and sister are, or because their fathers have different first names, like the husband and wife. Everybody has a different patronymic in this household. And so having the same patronymic name as someone else doesn't necessarily mean those 2 people are related. If 2 men with have the same first name, their children are going to have the same patronymic name simply because their fathers happen to have the same first name. So 2 men with the last name Mikkelsen may be brothers. They may have the same father, and that's why they are both Mikkelsens, or it just might mean that their dads happen to both be named Mikkel. It doesn't necessarily imply some sort of family relationship. And then the third part of that name is the farm name. And this is more of an address because every time somebody moved, they would use a different farm name. If they go from one farm to another, they will start using the farm name of whichever farm they were living on. So if we go back to our family again, I've got them living on the Vik farm. If they're all living on the Vik farm, they can all use that name Vik to indicate who they are. The children, now it's important to remember, the children are not using the name Vik because their father is using that name. And the wife is not using the name Vik because she's married to a husband using that name. They're using it simply because they all live together. They're all living on the Vik farm. Therefore, they are all entitled to use the name Vik. And if they move as a family next door to the Haugen farm, they will all start using the name Haugen. So they'll become Mikkel Larsen Haugen and Sigrid Olsdottir Haugen because they're living on a different farm. And if Lars moves away, if the rest of the family stays on the Vik farm, but he moves to the Haugen farm, he will start using Haugen while the rest of his family continues to use the name Vik. If a housekeeper moves in with them and starts living with them, she will start using the name Vik, even though she may not necessarily be related to the family she's living with. So having the same farm name doesn't necessarily mean people are related either. These two families have the last name Veek. They may just live in two separate houses on the same farm. They might not be related at all. And they might be, of course, they could potentially be related, but having that same farm name doesn't imply any type of kinship whatsoever. It is not necessarily indicative that these are two related families. And this concept of a farm name is so important for Norwegian genealogy because it is where so many Norwegian families got their last names. After arriving in the United States, a lot of Norwegian immigrants looked around and said, wait a second, you're kidding me. People have the same last name their whole lives. What are we going to do here? So a lot of them decided to keep that farm name that they left behind in Norway as a family name that was passed from father to child, just like we're accustomed to here in the United States. So if these naming traditions sound a little bit tricky, we do also have a class for Norwegian genealogy that covers these naming traditions in a lot more detail. That class is also offered online, and that will be again this fall. So anyway, back to the resources for genealogy. I alluded earlier, actually, I think I didn't allude, I specifically said it's important to double check the information that you find in a Bygde book because it might be incomplete or it might even just be straight up incorrect. And the place that we do that is in the Norwegian Lutheran Church records. The Norwegian Lutheran Church was the official vital statistics department for Norway up until 2012. It was very recent that they removed that responsibility from the church and set up a completely separate civil office for that. So all baptisms and marriages and confirmations and deaths were all recorded by the pastor at the congregational level. And they even kept records of who was moving in and out of the congregation. And these records are just, they are an absolute treasure. We do have these on microfilm here at NAGC. Now this, the one I have on the slide here, happens to be a baptism register from 1855, but you can see that the information on here is, this is incredible. You've got the child's name, you have the child's parents' names, you have a birth date, which farm the parents were living on. They even indicate on here whether or not the parents were married at the time the child was born. Now, children born out of wedlock were baptized in Norway, and the father is almost always named. He's almost always there. Very seldom will you see a child baptized with no father. So you don't need to fret if you encounter this in your genealogy. It's not a dead end. The father's name is probably going to be there. We're very, very fortunate this way. Norway did live in relative peace for the past several hundred years and hasn't had really, they're not natural disaster prone. So even during World War II, when Norway was occupied by the Nazis, records weren't destroyed, churches weren't burned. There hasn't been a lot of fires or floods that have destroyed a lot of records in Norway. They have not experienced much record loss. There, you will get the occasional landslide that will have damaged some records, or the occasional fire in a church that damaged some records in some parishes. But odds are your Norwegian family can be traced through church records well into the early 1700s, if not into the 1600s. When someone tells me that they have traced their Norwegian family back into the 1500s, I'll say, well, that's possible because the records have been very well preserved. They are very, very complete, and they're very, very accessible. Now, I'm happy to report that you don't actually have to use microfilm to access these records. You don't even have to leave your living room, because if they are old enough to be viewed by the public, if they've met the privacy restrictions in Norway, they are available for free on the Norwegian Digital Archives website. We are unbelievably fortunate. I could spend hours and hours talking about this website and what type of resources they have available here. This really is the holy grail for Norwegian research. They have scan images of the baptism registers, confirmation, marriage, burial, vaccinations, anything that the church was keeping track of, they have it on the Digital Archives website. They have every Norwegian census that's available to the public. The most recent one that we can get a hold of is 1920. So everything that's been taken up to 1920 is available there. They have immigration lists on there. Mostly those are more recent. So you're not going to find much prior to 1900. Unfortunately, it's mostly for after 1900. They do have court records on here. Of course, these are all in Norwegian. So unless you can read Norwegian, those might be kind of tricky to use. But the most useful ones in the court records are their probate records. They do have some decent probate records in Norway. There are also some other military records, but like I said, Norway's lived in relative peace, so there's not much to read in their military records, but they do have them. There are education, like school records. There are, not everybody was a member of the Lutheran Church in Norway, so they do have some civil marriage records for people who elected not to be married in the Lutheran Church. Now, this website is absolutely fantastic. It has so much that you can use for genealogy, but unfortunately, it's not always easy or intuitive to use. Most of the records are actually not indexed. So that means that if you want to take advantage of what's on there, and in order to use all this effectively, you do need to kind of have an inkling that an event occurred, and you have to kind of know where and when it took place. And then you have to be willing to sometimes just virtually, of course, because it's all online, pull out that book and page through it to look for the record that you're trying to find. I think there's a saying that says things can be fast, good, and free. Pick two. Well, the digital archives are good and they're free, but they're not always so fast. Sometimes it can take a lot of patience to find what you're looking for, but I think that is the nature of genealogy, right? To have patience and be willing to sift through a lot of things that aren't what we're looking for in order to find what we are. There is a search function on the website, but it's quite temperamental and it doesn't always work intuitively. It doesn't always work the way you think it's going to. So if you do try to use the search and you are getting frustrated because it doesn't seem to be working the way you expect it to, it's probably not you. Don't get discouraged. It's probably the website. We do also have a class that is dedicated just to using this website because it isn't the easiest website to use. And I did notice yesterday when I went and started poking around in there that they have started making some changes to it and that they're planning on making more changes to it in the coming months. So don't be alarmed if you start in there and then a couple days later, everything looks different. It's a scheduled update and some upgrades. So I'm hoping that the search gets easier with this and that more things get indexed. I don't know if that's what they're going to be doing, but I've got my fingers crossed that that's what they're up to. Now, because Norwegian genealogy has some unique aspects to it, the staff here has created some resources for our members and for the public. What I have here on the slide is our research guide. This is the 7th edition. You can get it directly from us on our website, or you can get it from Amazon. We have it there too. And we've added quite a bit. Quite a few things have changed since our last update a few years ago. So we've got some different websites in here. Some more tips for using the digital archives. We have information about using DNA and other innovations that have happened since that last revision. So if you're looking for something last minute for Mother's Day, maybe this is something you want to grab. For our members, this book is $20. And we also have a YouTube channel. We have some presentations on there that were done by one of our former researchers. He just retired earlier this year. His name is Jerry Paulson, and he's the one shown on the slide here. He's been doing Norwegian research since before I was born. So he has a lot of tips and suggestions for researching your family tree. I've also recorded some videos and put them on there. I'm not quite as famous as Jerry, but generally these are genealogy how-tos, and they typically pertain just to Norway and Norwegian-American records. They are all free. So go ahead and invite your friends over and get some popcorn and watch some great Norwegian genealogy videos on our YouTube channel. We also have a Facebook page, and that is a great way to keep up with everything that we have going on. This is where we announce all of our new classes or other events that we have coming up. When we get new additions to our library collection, we'll take pictures and post those on our Facebook page if we think it's something a lot of people are going to want to know about. When we add new staff, we put that on our page. And then we also add just genealogy tips and different announcements and things like that. One of the things we do every Monday is a Norwegian genealogy word of the week. So we'll post a word, explain what it means and where you're likely to find it, where you're going to encounter that word. So if you're interested in Norwegian genealogy, please like us and follow us so you can keep track of what we have going on and see the things that we have coming up. We do also sell this series of maps. Like I mentioned before, if you know where your ancestors came from, there's a really good chance that you'll be able to go back and drive right up to the farm where they used to live before they immigrated to the United States. So we carry this Norwegian map series. It shows all of the modern highways and cities and roads. And then it also shows the locations of all of the farms that are still there. Not every farm is still there. Some have been kind of absorbed by cities as they've expanded. But if the farm still exists, it'll be on these maps and it will be labeled. Now they cover a very small area, but they are extremely detailed. So the first time I went to Norway, I took about a dozen of these because each map covers such a small space. I needed that many maps just to find the different farms that my family left behind. But they are a fantastic map series. So if you're planning a trip and you want to get to where your ancestors were, we'd be happy to help you figure out which map you need and help you locate the farm on the map so you know exactly where you're headed. A real quick commercial here. Every year we do offer a new Christmas card with custom artwork just for our members. So this was the image that we had last year. It was created by a local artist. She's a Norwegian-American named Katie Maurer, and she does a new design for us every year. I haven't seen what 2024 is going to be, but this is what we did in 2023. Another thing that we do every other year, so our next trip will be in 2024. We just did one in 2022. We take a group of our members to the Family Search Library in Salt Lake City. And of course, this is not a trip that is just for people with Norwegian heritage. So if you want to try to talk your non-Norwegian spouse or friend into joining you on this trip, this is a great opportunity because genealogy libraries, generally speaking, are for everybody. I don't need to go into detail about everything that they have at the Family Search Library. But when we do our trip, we generally spend 5 days in Salt Lake City, and we spend most of that time just researching, independently working on our own genealogy research. We do reserve a classroom for occasional meetings throughout the week to kind of recongregate and talk about, bounce ideas off of each other. Who's having success, who's struggling, sharing ideas. We have a couple presentations. We do have dinner as a group a couple times while we're out there, but really most of the time is just spent researching. Somebody from NAGC, of course, would be on hand the entire time to help you or to point you in the direction of a different specialist at the library, someone maybe who specializes in French or Japanese or whatever it is that you're trying to research. And prior to leaving for the trip, we do have several Zoom meetings to make sure that you've got a plan, that you've done the research that you can from home before you go so that you can get the most out of the trip when you get there. It is really a fantastic thing to do, to be able to go and just, what I enjoy the most about it is just saying, hey, I don't have to run kids to practice. I don't have to do any of these things, housework, things that would distract me from doing research. I just have 5 days. All I'm going to do is sit and work on my own genealogy research. It is a really relaxing time for me. I really do enjoy going on this trip. So I mentioned some of the genealogy classes that we offer, but we do also offer Norwegian language classes. Those are in person. We offer them here right at our library, and we have definitely heard the cries for online language classes. So we're exploring that possibility. We're looking into expanding that as well in the near future. We offer translation services. So if you have books or documents, diaries, letters, anything like that that's in Norwegian that you would like translated into English, we have translators on staff here who can translate those for you. We also do research for you. If you have decided that that patronymic naming system is just too much and you're just not going to deal with it and you would like someone to do the research for you, we're happy to do that. Or if you have a specific brick wall that you're just trying to get over or get through or get around, drop us a line and see if we can help point you in the right direction on that. And we can also do one-on-one consultations too for an hour over Zoom or in person, whatever works for you, and just go through what you've done and give you some ideas of where you might want to look next, what the next step might be. If you've taken one of those DNA tests like Ancestry or 23andMe, and I do recommend those for Norwegians actually, because you may have noticed the naming system isn't always the easiest thing to figure out. And just because you share a last name with somebody doesn't mean you're related. So I do often suggest to Norwegians that they consider a DNA test, because sometimes that's the only way to know the difference between one Lars Anderson and another Lars Anderson. Sometimes we just have to resort to DNA on that. And I'm thankful that we have that as a tool. But if you need help understanding what your DNA results can and can't tell you, what they are and what they aren't saying, we'd be happy to sit down with you and talk about that and take a look at those and see what we can learn from that. And then I also do things like this. If you're looking for a speaker for your genealogy society, your Sons of Norway lodge, your local public library is looking for a speaker or a program or a family reunion, I've done those. Let me know. I would love to be a part of anything that you have going on. If I can contribute, I'd love to be a part of that. I can do those in person. I can do them over Zoom, whatever works for you. Now, we are a nonprofit. We are not supported by tax dollars. So we do charge for our services to help us keep our lights on. But there is a pretty large discount if you are a member. So we would love to see you as a member, even if it's only to get a discount on classes and some of the services that we offer. We would still love to have you. We always look forward to meeting new people who are enthusiastic about their Norwegian heritage and would love to see you. So here is our website and our email and our phone numbers. So if you need any help from us, you can reach us here. And be sure to check out our website and our Facebook page so you can see the classes that we have coming up and check out some of those videos. Maybe you can get some tidbits out of there as well. So Sarah, did we have some good things coming up in the Q&A?
Oh, we did.
I was hoping so.
Caffeinate yourself up here. All right. Well, thank you, Dana. That was very good. We had a lot of questions. Some of them you answered. We had a question about, is your organization doing any digitizing? Like, what are you digitizing any of those farm books? And I'm not even going to try to pronounce that word, but, or do you know of anyone who is doing digitization of those books?
Well, most of them are under copyright.
Okay.
So we can't, unfortunately, just digitize them at will. I would love to have every single one of these books on the shelves digitized, but because of the copyright, we can't just do that. I will say that the Norwegian National Library, that's kind of their equivalent to our Library of Congress. They have, if the book is in the public domain, they have made some of those Big to Book available in digital format. I know for a fact that the Voss one is completely available because it's in the public domain. So if you're on their website, you can go to books that are in the public domain and see them.
Okay. So Janet says, how do you connect a farm name to a specific book? I guess maybe she has the farm name of her family, but she doesn't know which book would relate or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yep, I know, I totally understand what she's asking. One great resource for figuring out, because those books are regional, we need to know where in Norway your ancestor came from. And the farm name is a really good clue as to where they might have came from. If you have a rather unusual farm name, and some of them are very unique, sometimes people will come in and say, this is what it's called. And I'll say, oh my gosh, I bet there's only one called that, because I've never heard that in my life. But a good place to look, I like to look at in the Family Search Wiki, because a lot of the pages in the wiki will, the parish pages will list all of the farms in that parish on the Family Search Wiki. So that is a fantastic resource for looking for which parish your ancestors may have come from. If your ancestors came from a fairly common farm name, like a Bakken or something like that, we may have to try to sneak in the back door by, using other techniques that you would use for any ethnic group, like looking at obituaries and looking at doing cluster research. Where were their neighbors from? And hoping to figure out where in Norway they may have come from. Okay. Generally, those Big to Book, generally the region covered by the Big to Book corresponds pretty neatly to a church parish. So there, sometimes a book will cover multiple parishes. It all depends on what the author had in mind, but that's usually where we start, is the Family Search Wiki. See if we can find it there. There is another good website too, Olaf Rigg. He was a professor in Norway who researched the history of the names of these farms. And I will look for that website and send it to you, Sarah, so that we have that. But it's a searchable online database. The problem with that, you can search by farm name. The problem with it is that you have to be pretty flexible with your spelling. So if you don't get any results the first time, just try spelling it a different way. And you may be able to find, it'll show you the name of the farm and what parish it's in. So that will help point you to the right book to look in. Okay.
And then you put up that page at the very end, with the contact information for your center and also the research fees. Do you do like quick lookups for people, or is that one of the research fees that they would have to do, like they'd have to pay for that research, or do you do kind of quick lookups for people in a source, like if they named the source?
So you mean like if somebody they knew what book they wanted to look in?
Yeah, and
we're just like,
maybe.
oh, yeah, like I know what section I want. If it is super quick and we can answer the question in just a few minutes, we wouldn't charge. But if it came to the point of where people want, like, well, can you scan 10 pages and email that to me so I can look at it, then we might have to start the clock. But yeah, if it's we get emails periodically where people will say, oh, I'm just wondering, does this book exist? Or my ancestor, I think, was called this. Does that sound right? Does that sound like a Norwegian name to you? And we'll answer questions like that.
Yeah. Okay, that's cool. Somebody says, I know the farm of my ancestor and I want to visit. Do you have suggestions on how you would get permission to visit? She says she doesn't want to show up unannounced, but she says she does not speak Norwegian either.
Oh, sure. Certainly Norwegians appreciate that kind of courtesy. One thing that I will say is trespassing laws in Norway are not nearly as strict as they are here in the United States. If you walk on somebody's lawn in Norway, you don't have to worry about them. Generally speaking, they're not going to get upset about you stepping off the sidewalk like the way that you might expect an American could. They're a lot more flexible with appreciating nature and property, and they're not as rigid about those types of rules as we are. That's one of a cultural difference between our countries. But if you know where the farm is and you know like the local community that it's closest to, I would suggest contacting that like their local government or their local public library. Generally, their municipal website will have contact information, and they often have like a cultural director or a historian or some sort of person whose role is to kind of facilitate these types of interactions. So you can email, and they almost always speak English. So you can email the local community government office and say, hey, this is what I want to do. I would like to get in touch with the people who own this particular property so I can get permission to visit. And they can give you that information, kind of point you in the right direction.
Okay. Kind of along this line is, do you have any listings of or information about how they would go about finding themselves somebody in Norway that could do research for them, or that kind of thing?
Sure, to do genealogical research in Norway.
Yeah, and historical research. Like if they wanted to hire someone in Norway to do some work for them. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, I would probably also contact the local government for that, or the local public library for that. But you probably don't need someone in Norway to do that for you, because they're just going to go to the same National Archives website or the Digital Archives website that we would go to. There isn't, in terms of the church records, they don't have access to anything that we don't have or that you don't have access to. But yeah, I would say if you want someone to do some, you know, giving you some more historical information, cultural information about that area, I would contact the local public library or their local government office, their cultural director there.
Okay, thank you. Okay, somebody says, what if the family was not of the Lutheran religion? And then she says she believes her family was Methodist.
Yes. No, so Norway did have a state church. So it was expected that everyone would be Lutheran, but there definitely were people who weren't. They had Jewish populations, they had Quakers, they had people of other faiths. In particular, in the larger cities, you'll see this more often. In the Lutheran church books, there is often a section for dissenters, and that was what they called people who weren't Lutheran. And so they would record the dissenter births and marriages in that section of the church book. So the baptisms and burials were still reported to the church, but it was recorded in the dissenter section.
Okay. We have a couple people that would like to volunteer for your center, but they don't live nearby. Do you need any virtual volunteers?
Yes, we should talk about our databases. One of the things that people can do with our databases is if they see something that they would like to correct or add to those databases, there is a, you know, submit suggested changes form, and those all need to be vetted. Just because, you know, anybody theoretically can suggest a change, and we do need to verify that what they're suggesting is accurate. accurate. So we're always looking for help with that type of stuff. So if you're interested, send us an email and we can talk about how you might be able to help.
Yeah. Okay. Do you guys take donations? Somebody has some Dane County, Wisconsin, Norwegian certificates from churches and schools.
We do accept donations if it's library appropriate, books, we're always welcome books to be donated. Now it sounds like this might be more appropriate for an archive. If it's a document, like sometimes people will bring us letters, things like that, and we don't accept those because we don't have archival storage. We don't have the proper climate control to be considered a bona fide archive. So if you have things like that, original documents, certificates, I always recommend contacting the Norwegian-American Historical Association in Northfield, Minnesota. They're affiliated with St. Olaf, the St. Olaf College there. They are a genuine archive. They just spent a lot of money. They got a nice grant to upgrade their archival facilities. So if you have original documents like letters and photographs and things that aren't compiled into a family history book, I recommend sending them there because they have the proper facilities to store and properly care for that type of material.
Okay. We're getting down to the end of our time. We're going to have a couple more questions, but I'm going to put this in the chat. If you want to send an email to us, or you can also send an email to Dana's organization if your question didn't get answered.
Yes, please do.
Okay, so we have some like real specific questions. So somebody's asking, do you have Norwegian records for Cook County, Illinois? And I don't know if you know that off the top of your head. Like this would be Norwegian-American records, obviously.
Right. Yep. Off the top of my head, I know that we have some books that are, about the Norwegians in the Chicago area. But in terms of records off the top of my head, I don't know, but our card catalog is online. So you can search that for free and see what you come up with there. And it's right on our website.
Yeah. Okay. Here's somebody who's talking about a mixed marriage. She's got a Norwegian great grandmother. So the female in the family was Norwegian and the male in the family, her husband, was Swedish. Do you have a guess? Would they have picked one church over the other, or would it have been kind of look both places kind of thing?
Well, my first question is, are they in the United States?
Yes.
Okay. When it comes
US,
to the church,
Canada.
okay.
Yeah.
They probably would have joined whichever Lutheran church was closest geographically for them. If they were in a primarily Swedish community, they probably joined a Swedish Lutheran church. If they were in a primarily Norwegian community, they probably joined a Norwegian church. And they may have, though, taken advantage of not having a state church and become Episcopalian, or a lot of them did become LDS. A lot of Scandinavians did. So I wouldn't rule any denomination out. That's for sure.
Okay, I think this is going to be our last question. There's still some questions in the Q&A about specific things about your particular center, and I encourage people to go to the handout, get the URL, contact, send an email or a phone call to them there in Madison, and they can answer your specific questions about the center. Now, this last question is more of and this may take you a minute or two to answer, it's more of a procedural genealogical question for particular, problems with Scandinavians. And she says, my great-grandmother was born in Wisconsin and her parents were born in Norway. Because their name, Nelson, is so common, I have yet to identify her parents. So I guess the great-grandmother came to the US and she has no idea who the parents were other than the name is Nelson. Do you have suggestions for her on what she can do to kind of dig in further to find more clues about who these particular Nelsons could be?
Okay.
I don't know.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of first things first is I would see what every document you can find here in the United States, you know, a death record for the great-grandmother, a marriage record for the great-grandmother, because oftentimes the parents are named on there. And don't limit yourself just to civil records here in the US. Try church records, because oftentimes the church records have more detail. When I look at the Norwegians brought their great record keeping with them when they came to this country. So their Lutheran churches often included what parish they left behind in Norway. It often included the names of the parents of people who were getting married and getting confirmed. And that information's often in those church records. And I know in the Midwest here, in Wisconsin especially, church records are usually older than the civil records. So you might have more luck looking at church records for that kind of information. I would also take a look at, you know, if you have access to digitized newspapers, sometimes that will give you a clue as to where they would have come from in Norway. If they, you know, or if your ancestor was celebrating a birthday, you know, if she got rather old, if she was turning 90, they might mention, you know, Mrs. Nelson came from, you know, Trondheim, Norway in 1859 or whatever year it was. They might include that kind of information there. And it was really common for Norwegians to immigrate as a group. They would settle in, they would leave as a cluster in Norway and settle in a community here in the Midwest with all of their old neighbors. So if she landed in an area that was heavily settled by people from Sigdal or Eggedal or something like that, there's a pretty good chance that she was from there too. And that would be a good place to start looking. At the end of the day, the only tool we may have, sometimes none of these things work, and sometimes we have to look at DNA. And that will point us to which part of Norway she came from. And then we'll, you know, be able to look at baptism records and figure out who this person is. Because sometimes one thing that is nice about Norwegians, when they changed their first name to an American name, it was pretty predictable. So if your Norwegian ancestor was named Lewis, I would bet the farm that he was Lars in Norway. If he was going by, you know, Ingebrigt in Norway, a lot of times they would change their name to Albert here. So there was some pretty predictable name changes that might point us to the right people too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll piggyback on that. Thank you, Dana. That was really great. And that was like a master class in like 3 minutes of how to do research on really any immigrant ancestor almost.
Right.
Is like look at the US records, really scour them offline and online, look at the neighbors, and then try your DNA if nothing else works. And I was going to say, with the DNA, with Ancestry DNA, which I'm not affiliated with them, but they do show you a community that your family might have been from sometimes, if you have enough matches to that community. So you might get a location in Norway just from your DNA testing of your ethnicity. It might say you're Norwegian, 25%, and then it might say from this area of Norway. And so then that kind of gives you a clue also of where to look, as well as just looking at your matches and trying to sort out who they are in relation to your known family members. So anyways, well, I want to thank you, Dana. This was really wonderful. People are loving it. We had a lot of people in the chat who were like, you know, this was the best thing since sliced bread. So they learned a lot.
Thank you.
And you had very clear explanations and just so much goodwill in the chat. So thank you very much. And like I said before, this will be placed on our YouTube channel eventually. We do have to edit it first, so it's not going to be there tomorrow. But so thank you very much, and we will sign off and see you on Thursday at 6:30 for our evening program.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye,
you very
everyone.
much for having me.
Yep.